In 1948, 20 massive electric locomotives stood prepared. These units, designed with 8 axles for Soviet railway infrastructure and Stalin's industrial ambitions, each boasted 5,500 horsepower. However, the United States government abruptly halted their export. Overnight, these locomotives, dubbed Little Joes, were embargoed. Too foreign for sale, yet too powerful to simply dismantle. $20 million worth of engineering prowess found itself stranded at an American port. This narrative explores how Cold War anxieties nearly condemned the world's most robust engines, until a financially struggling railway in the Rocky Mountains made a daring decision that forever altered American rail transport. Why did Moscow's electric giants end up confronting America's most treacherous mountain passes instead? The General Electric EF4 bore no resemblance to typical American locomotives. It was an imposing leviathan, weighing 170 tons of steel and copper and stretching nearly 90 feet from end to end. Its 8 axles, each powered by a motor the size of a barrel, were built to traverse the vast forests and frozen rivers of Siberia. The chassis was a fortress, engineered to withstand derailments and the brutal -40-degree Ural winters. Every circuit and relay was over-engineered, and every panel was securely bolted to resist the kind of cold that can fracture metal. Massive 5-foot-wide trucks, too broad for any track in the United States, rested beneath the body like a hulking beast, their wheels alone weighing as much as a family car. Above them, a complex array of switchgear and transformers awaited the 3,300 volts of direct current supplied by Soviet power lines. This was not a machine for the gentle inclines of the Midwest. It was designed to haul thousands of tons up steep mountain grades, ensuring freight movement even when everything else froze solid. Inside, the cab was purely utilitarian. Devoid of embellishments, it featured a row of robust levers and gauges marked in Cyrillic, installed under the watchful eyes of Soviet engineers. The control console was configured for 2 operators, one to drive and one to monitor the continuous stream of data as the 8 traction motors roared to life. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and hot oil, the floor vibrating with the immense power capable of outperforming a Union Pacific big boy steam locomotive. The electrical system was a marvel in itself. 8 motors, rated at 750 volts and wired for maximum torque, drew power from overhead lines via a pair of pantographs that arced upwards like the antennae of a metallic insect. The main bus bars, as thick as a man's wrist, carried enough current to fuse a wrench to the frame if it were accidentally dropped in the wrong place. Every aspect of the design embodied durability. There was no elaborate streamlining, just solid slabs of riveted metal and a paint job tough enough to survive a Siberian sandstorm. Yet, despite its raw power, the EF4 was an anomaly in America. The track gauge was incorrect, the couplers were incompatible, and even the voltage presented a challenge. American lines utilized 3,000 volts, not 3,300. The locomotive was too alien for the nation that had manufactured it. But as it sat idle, its engines cold, one couldn't help but feel a grudging admiration. This represented engineering at its most unyielding. A machine crafted for conflict, for vast empires, for tasks that would consume lesser engines and reduce them to scrap. In the desolate workshops, GE engineers examined the locomotives, marveling at their broad axles and thick steel beams. They had set out to construct an engine for Stalin, and, in doing so, had created a behemoth too powerful for its era. The machinery was prepared. The world around it was not. On a bleak morning in 1948, a telegram reached the port of Erie. The message from the United States State Department mandated an immediate halt to all shipments bound for the Soviet Union. The nascent Cold War had transformed a routine export into a matter of national security. Cranes, in the middle of lifting 200 tons of steel onto a waiting freighter, froze mid-operation. Dock workers put down their tools. Soviet engineers, who had meticulously overseen every bolt and cable, packed their belongings and boarded trains departing from Pennsylvania. The directive was unambiguous. These locomotives were now classified as strategic materials and would not be permitted to leave American soil. 20 locomotives, each a technological marvel, were left in limbo. General Electric managers, who had dedicated years to building to a foreign specification, now faced a warehouse full of machines that no one wanted. The engines were too large, too heavy, and too foreign for American railroads. Their wheels were spaced for Russian tracks at 5 feet wide instead of the American standard. The couplers were European hooks, useless on U.S. freight cars. The electrical systems required 3,300 volts of direct current, a specification that didn't match any American power grids. Each unit bore Cyrillic labels, a lingering reminder of a deal that had dissolved with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. Within General Electric boardrooms, pride gave way to panic. The company had invested millions in the Soviet contract, anticipating recouping costs through sheer volume and subsequent orders. Now the locomotives sat dormant, accumulating dust, their value diminishing daily. Insurance adjusters toured the storage yards, tallying up losses. Engineers debated whether it was more cost-effective to cannibalize the engines for parts or to simply scrap them. With each passing day, the clock ticked, rendering the stranded fleet an increasing liability. The State Department's embargo didn't merely block a shipment. It transformed a symbol of American industrial might into a logistical quagmire. No American railroad was interested in purchasing a locomotive that didn't fit the tracks, couldn't connect to standard rolling stock, and operated on the wrong voltage. General Electric salespeople contacted every corner of the country, touting the engines as a bargain to any railroad desperate enough to consider them. Each time, the response was identical. Too risky, too costly to convert, too much trouble. The port's storage lots became a graveyard for unwanted innovation. 20 machines, engineered for the harshest winters and longest hauls, now sat silent behind locked gates. The only movement came from the wind rustling loose tarps and the occasional click of a security guard's flashlight. In the wake of a single telegram, the most powerful electric locomotives on Earth had transitioned from prized exports to orphans, marooned by political currents, frozen in time, and awaiting a miraculous buyer who might never materialize. The Milwaukee Road's boardroom was not a place for grand aspirations. In 1949, the railroad was operating on borrowed time and borrowed capital. Its electrified mountain lines limped along behind engines dating back to before the First World War. Each month brought fresh repair bills and new warnings from the accountants. There was no money for new power, certainly not for anything as exotic as a Soviet export. However, desperation can make a bargain seem like a miracle. General Electric, burdened with a warehouse full of unsellable giants, was eager to make a deal. The price they had once quoted to Stalin was a distant memory. The new offer was almost an affront to the engineers who had designed the world's most powerful electric locomotive. 12 units, barely used, for approximately $1 million, less than a fifth of their construction cost. This amounted to roughly $80,000 per locomotive. For that sum, the Milwaukee Road could purchase a handful of new diesels, or it could take a chance on these Cold War orphans. The railroad's management signed the papers. The agreement included not only the locomotives, but also a mountain of spare parts, motors, relays, and enough copper wire to keep the shops busy for years. General Electric was relieved to see them go. The engines were loaded onto flat cars and directed westward, towards the Rockies. In the media, the acquisition appeared to be a reckless gamble. Critics branded the Little Joes as white elephants, novelties that would financially drain the Milwaukee Road. But within the back offices, the reasoning was straightforward. The railroad needed power, and no other option on the market could rival their specifications. The Little Joes promised 5,500 horsepower each, sufficient to haul the heaviest freight over the Bitterroot grades. The Milwaukee Road's existing fleet was crumbling. Its oldest electrics dated back to 1915, and their maintenance costs were crippling the railroad. Dieselization was sweeping the industry, but replacing the entire mountain fleet with new diesels would have cost millions, money the company simply did not possess. The deal wasn't without risk. The Little Joes were built to Soviet standards, and every inch of them would require modification before they could operate on American rails. But the price was too good to refuse. For General Electric, it was a fire sale, a way to clear their books and move forward. For Milwaukee, it was a last-ditch effort. The engines rolled into the shops at Deer Lodge, Montana, their Russian wheel sets still too wide for the tracks, their control panels still marked with Cyrillic. Shop crews gathered around, assessing the challenge. Veterans shook their heads in doubt. Younger mechanics grinned with anticipation. The railroad hadn't made such a significant wager in decades. 12 locomotives, acquired for pennies on the dollar, awaited a second chance. The Milwaukee Road's future would depend on whether these Soviet-built behemoths could be tamed. The gamble was set. The only path forward was through the workshop doors and up America's steepest grades. In the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, the Deer Lodge shops transformed into a laboratory for American ingenuity. The Little Joes arrived as enigmatic giants, massive, mysterious, and utterly incompatible with anything the Milwaukee Road had ever owned. Shop crews, some of whom had spent their entire careers patching up ancient box cabs, now confronted a machine that seemed to belong to another planet. There was no guide for the tasks ahead. Every step was a risk, every repair an experiment. The initial task was the most physically demanding. Those Russian 5-foot-wide wheel sets wouldn't even fit on the rails outside the shop doors. Mechanics rolled the trucks into the bay, marked the axles, and commenced work with hydraulic presses. Each wheel was pressed off the axle. The steel was measured, cut down, and then pressed back together precisely at 4 feet 8.5 inches. The mere 3-inch difference might not seem significant, until one compared the vintage wheels with their modern counterparts, revealing a stark contrast that highlighted the substantial gap between two engineering philosophies. Any misstep could cause a wheel set to crumble under the locomotive's immense mass. Nevertheless, the workshop teams flawlessly performed this intricate task repeatedly, enabling all 12 engines to traverse American railway lines for the inaugural time. Following this, attention shifted to the couplers. European hook-style couplers were incompatible with American freight cars, necessitating their removal and replacement with robust American knuckle couplers by skilled welders. The air crackled with sparks as metal met metal, and the lingering scent of burnt steel permeated the facility for days. Each coupler had to be absolutely perfect. A single flawed weld could lead to a train's disintegration on a steep mountain incline. The crews toiled with an unwavering sense of pride, understanding they were undertaking an endeavor unmatched anywhere else in the nation. With each completion, a locomotive shed a bit of its Russian identity, becoming progressively more integrated into the Montanan landscape. The true challenge emerged with the electrical systems. The Little Joes were engineered for 3,300 volts of Soviet current, while the Milwaukee Road's catenary delivered 3,000 volts. Electricians delved into the control cabinets, tracing Cyrillic-labeled wires, and systematically exchanging transformers and relays to align with the American standard. Some younger staff members lightheartedly suggested learning Russian to decipher the schematics, but the seasoned veterans simply shook their heads and persisted with the rewiring. The pantographs underwent thorough inspections, and the main bus bars were meticulously insulated against potential power surges. The moment the switch was initially thrown, a brief hush settled, followed by the synchronized hum of 8 traction motors, drawing power from the mountain grid. Inside the cab, the transformation continued. Levers were relabeled, gauges recalibrated, and the heavy Soviet-era placards were substituted with custom Milwaukee stencils. For the first time, an American engineer could board and immediately comprehend the function of every dial. The control stands were rigorously tested, the brakes precisely adjusted, and these massive steel locomotives rolled out into the rail yard for their initial test runs. Each locomotive successfully passed inspection, one after another, until the entire fleet was prepared. The workshop floor, once a hub of skepticism and apprehension, now resonated with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The little Joes were no longer out of place. They were ready for the mountains. Snow accumulated thickly along the Bitterroot line as two recently modified little Joes stood poised at the base of St. Paul Pass. The crew in the leading locomotive meticulously reviewed their checklists. Brakes verified, pantographs elevated, controls humming with American voltage. Ahead, 7 miles of track ascended at a consistent 2% gradient, a segment that had posed a significant challenge to engines for decades. Typically, 4 diesel units, laboring in unison, spewing smoke and struggling for traction, were required to haul a fully laden freight train over this mountain. Today, only 2 of the new electric locomotives would attempt this feat alone. Upon receiving a signal from the conductor, the throttle was advanced. 8 traction motors surged, and the entire train began to move, initially slowly, then gaining velocity with an unparalleled smoothness that the seasoned railroaders had never before witnessed. The sound was distinct, not a roar, but the escalating whine of electricity, accompanied by the deep rumble of steel wheels on the frozen tracks. Inside the cab, the engineer observed the ammeter needle soar. The little Joes remained unflustered. They steadfastly ascended the gradient, pulling thousands of tons behind them without ever falling below 12 miles per hour. By the time the lead headlight vanished into the summit tunnel, the crew's faces were beaming. The logbook for that journey recorded a time that surpassed any diesel's performance, achieved without a hint of wheel slippage. In the rail yards, word disseminated rapidly. The shop crews, who had endured the arduous conversion process, now had undeniable proof. These machines were more than just an economical acquisition. They represented a revolution. The legend of the Little Joes commenced with that ascent. 2 engines accomplishing the work of 4, and doing so with impressive flair. The Little Joes did not merely pass their initial mountain trial. They became legendary on the Milwaukee Road. Crews who had spent years arduously coaxing antiquated engines over treacherous gradients now found themselves at the helm of a machine capable of outmatching anything else on the tracks. Veterans who had initially questioned the Soviet imports began sharing anecdotes in the bunkhouse. One engineer boasted that a little Joe could pull a full string of loaded boxcars up St. Paul Pass with ample power remaining. Another quipped that the only sound louder than the motors was the complaining of a diesel crew in the siding. These locomotives did not just transport freight, they also hauled the Olympian Hiawatha, Milwaukee's premier passenger train, gliding through the Rockies with a grace that captivated travelers. When the Korean War, and later Vietnam, necessitated substantial military shipments, the Little Joes spearheaded the effort, tirelessly pulling endless convoys of tanks, ammunition, and provisions across the summits. The Mountain Division crews affectionately dubbed them sports cars in a realm of farm tractors. More than one engineer affirmed that a Little Joe would accelerate instantly upon throttle application, even with thousands of tons in tow. Oral histories from Deer Lodge to Avery consistently recount the same narrative. Reliability, immense power, and an unyielding loyalty. The crews imbued the name Little Joe with a new significance, less a veiled jab at Stalin and more a badge of honor for a locomotive that consistently persevered, irrespective of weather, cargo, or the political obstacles it encountered. Today, as American railroads predominantly rely on diesel power, the last remaining Little Joe stands silently in Montana, a testament to engineering prowess that outlived political tides. The enduring lesson is clear. Innovation transcends national boundaries, yet short-sighted decisions can obliterate decades of progress overnight. When we prioritize immediate profit over lasting value, we risk losing more than just machinery. What are your thoughts? Was it foresight or a blunder? Let's discuss in the comments.